I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in Art Criticism and Writing here at the School of Visual Arts. This is the second event in our spring series. On March 25th, Alfredo Jar will show his film, The Ashes of Pasolini, and talk with me about Pasolini's importance as a poet and critic. And on April 22nd, Sharon Neshat will show her new film, Women Without Men. Anne Lauterbach is a poet. She's many other things as well, but she's a poet first. I'd argue that she didn't choose to be a poet, but that it was given to her to be. But I'm sure she'll clarify this. While being a poet, Anne has also been a teacher and a lover of art. I've had the great pleasure and good fortune over the last 9 years, 10 years, to teach for her and with her in the MFA program at Bard College. And one of the signal pleasures of that has been to witness Anne's direct, immediate responses to artworks and group critiques, where she has a truly astonishing way of digressing into clarity. She begins to talk while looking at and experiencing the painting or sculpture or installation or photo or video or poem or whatever, and her language starts to coalesce around and into the work in a way that you can actually see and feel and hear. It's not abstract. There are many people in this room who've also witnessed this phenomenon and know what I'm talking about. It's like watching someone make the world up. There's a tremendous generosity in this, and it makes you want to do it too. And I guess that's why she's one of the great teachers. Anne is the author of 8 books of poetry, many collaborations with artists, and a collection of essays called The Night Sky, Writings on the Poetics of Experience. Her most recent book of poetry, Or to Begin Again, was a 2009 National Book Award finalist, and she received the MacArthur Fellowship in 1993. Since 1991, she has been chair of writing at the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts at Bard, where she's also Schwab Professor of Languages and Literature, and she's a visiting core critic at the Yale Graduate School of the Arts. Please welcome Anne Lauterbach.
Thank you, Levi. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Somewhat daunting to see my name in lights, for I'm sure the first and very last time. I apologize in advance for my voice. It keeps doing this thing. I don't know what it is, but it seems to have a frog in it. This is what you get for living in the country. This is truly is a meditation. It has moments of polemics and moments of abstraction. I think of it now as a kind of negative pep talk for all of you, the given and the chosen. It's going to take about 40 minutes from my timing, and there will be no visuals. So, I don't know, get your iPads out, I guess. The given and the chosen. A few days ago, I was having dinner with a friend, the novelist Paul Lafarge, and he asked, "What is this talk you are giving at SVA about? The description is mysterious." Maybe he said unclear. Maybe he said ambiguous. I thought, that again, the about. It's an old question, the subject of the subject. People ask when I tell them I am a poet, what are your poems about? It is a question I can almost never answer. The poems find their subjects as they are made. I do not want to suggest that there is no there, no outside. On the contrary, the world, its objects and events press toward the poems, competing for a place. And I have to try to make sufficient room for this crowd, this variousness. But the world as such cannot be in the poems. Only language can be in the poems. Language is the poem's material given. I might then say, in answer to the question, what are your poems about? What is this talk about? That they are about what might arise between the given and the chosen. I think the art and writing I most care about thickens and alludes, blurs, and enriches my sense of the subject so that who I am and what it is engage in a fluid exchange. This is not a mystical experience. One does not depart into some other realm. It is instead an intensification of the awareness of consciousness itself. The mediate space between Freud's pleasure principle and the death drive, eros and thanatos, is this third term, the will to make something from something, poiesis. Eros moves us toward the other, desiring, and thanatos pushes back with the limit, the end. Between the two, forms occur. My sense of pleasure, both as a writer and as a viewer or reader, derives in part from feeling at the indeterminate threshold, the shift between the given and the chosen. Wallace Stevens notes toward a supreme fiction. He had to choose, but it was not a choice between, but of. He chose to include the things that in each other are included, the whole, the complicate, the amassing harmony. The given and the chosen, the gift and the choice, the prior and the yet to come, the two terms do not form a proper binary. They do not glare at each other over an abyss of opposition or negation, but rather slide toward and away from each other like sunlight on a wire. They seem to carry spiritual or even religious overtones with phrases like the gift of life and the chosen people hovering uneasily over our secular heads. There is an unnerving temporal ambiguity between the fact of the given and the incipience of the gift, between the apprehension of more than one and the preferential limiting moment of choice. Etymologically, choice gathers to itself taste and wish and favor, enjoyment, desire, love, and pleasure. Gift, on the other hand, brings with it payment, specifically for a wife, and poison. But those of you who are familiar with the work of Marcel Mauss or Lewis Hyde know that the concept of the gift is both ancient and vexed, touching at the very quick of our notions of reciprocity, as well as our sense of what is innate. The child, we say, is gifted. Somebody needs some water? I live now in the country and am increasingly conscious of the dispositions of choice in relation to time, the temporal economy of being. Many of us, persons whose lives are reasonably successful and who have a fairly normal complement of responsibilities, seem to live perpetually close to a kind of temporal anarchy. Days are spent in stressed imbalances between needs and desires, preparations and accomplishments, the wish for solitude and the wish to participate. Expectation and result, effort and efficacy, reception and response, these permutating causalities feel attenuated and torn. It is as if we were suspended like atomic particles in a hectic medium, each unable to either come to rest or to find our way to the solace of molecular attachment. Our hope that the heart and mind will work in concert and that this heart-mind will be embodied in our actions and responses seems as near as a walk on the beach in February. For our time, perhaps Michel Foucault came closest to diagnosing the causes of anguish of the modern Western subject. Deleuze, speaking about Foucault, remarks, "Finally, in the last books, there's a discovery of thought, as establishing ways of existing, or, as Nietzsche put it, inventing new possibilities of life, existing not as a subject, but as a work of art. And this last phase presents thought as artistry. Many years ago, it might have been 1973 or 1974, I gave a course at St. Martin's School of Art in London called Choice, Decision, and Judgment. I was interested then, as I am now, in asking questions about the possible relation between forms of life and forms of art. At the time, I was concerned with individuals, persons, identities. I wanted to know if the sequence of choice, decision, and judgment in one's quotidian life might have some bearing on that same sequence, choice, decision, judgment, in making art. Was there some innate tendency or even habit in both domains that could be discerned so that a work of art somehow captured the essence of a person? Contrarily, could the process of making choices, decisions, and judgments in art making, in fact, condition and shape a person's life? Perhaps unsurprisingly, the figure that came closest to resolving this conundrum for me was John Cage. In Cage, there seemed to be a continuum between the given and the chosen, so closely calibrated as to be indistinguishable, seamless. One sensed in Cage an active receptivity that reconfigured desire into a form of waiting or listening, that reset choice into operations of chance. Somehow Cage had found a way to convert life into art and art into life. This seemed to me an emblem of personal contentment that might extend into the world as an ethical proposal. I grew up in Lower Manhattan, the child of urban, enlightened, secular, progressive, left idealists steeped in utopian visions of the possibility of making a better world. One of them, my father, would die of polio when he was 36, and the other, my mother, would become an alcoholic and abandon her children, dying at 53. Perhaps it is the dissonance between these initial sets that made me curious in the first place to think about the relation of the given to the chosen. I find myself aware of a residuum that settles down below fluctual reality, beneath all attempts to change or reconfigure the facts and their consequences into fresh potentials. This residuum is like a flavor, a stain, or a scent, in the sense that these things can stay behind after the agent has left. What is the nature of this residuum in terms of subjective experience? In my case, it is a combination of precariousness and loss as initial given tropes of existence. These feelings govern the various ameliorations of a somewhat productive life. They cannot be dislodged. But neither need they orchestrate the animate attachments to the actual that beckon, engage, and enhance the days. The self, I want to believe, is layered and aspectual. It can shift and turn and connect variously to various stimuli. It has agility at its core, a mechanism of survival and response that can be freed from ingrained habits. Habits are economical for sure, but they cost us in fluidity, openness, quickness. How then do we integrate our sense of self with our will to change? Sitting in my living room with my friend and former student, poet, and translator, Stacy Doris, we are having an easy conversation which comes into focus when she comments that we all have an inheritance, language, family, culture, generation, but that what we do is to take this responsibility and reconfigure it. These words, responsibility and reconfigure, are precise in relation to my concerns about subjectivity and art making. I like the idea that certain givens or inheritances, which cannot be factually altered, can be reconfigured, sometimes beyond all recognition. This reconfiguration does not abandon the initial individuated reality, but alters its internal shape, its syntax, if you like, to allow new possibilities. The fact of the reconfiguration provides an opening through which what already exists finds itself in what does not yet exist. This opening is an invitation. By now, it must be clear to you that I am disinclined to the force of linear argument, wary of the discretions of causal logic. Not surprisingly, I am also fearful of authority and certitude. I like to assemble pieces, fragments, stuff. I like to digress and wander and scan in the hopes of finding an arrangement of suggestive provisional affiliations. Wealth continues to concentrate. If we can't formulate digital ideals before our appointment with destiny, he warns, we will have failed to bring about a better world. Instead, we'll usher in a dark age in which everything human is devalued. Manifestos by nature are given to exaggeration and hyperbole, but linear stirs up free-floating anxiety. What we assume is given, our humanity, might be being taken away, eradicated, annulled before our very eyes. We have heard such alarms before. Ortega y Gasset in 1948 thought that abstraction was dehumanizing art. Television was seen as the death of familial conversation and literacy. It is hard to separate the message from the messenger. But the instrumental products of our culture, these gorgeous, sleek toys, do seem to turn everyone into objectified data, indifferent or immune to our status as persons with lives beyond Facebook communities, instant replays, and replies. How might we inhabit this other world, unrecorded and unobserved? Do we cease to exist when we are here in the actuality of a physical elsewhere? My young friend, part of the conversation, harder to consume. Everyone is a creator, throwaway, libertarian paternalism. People want to be led, a tool, not an obligation, media shift. We're all watching each other, vaster wasteland, shake in rather than shake out. Not enough jobs, fading industry, frivolous for free, not institutions but individuals with things to do, arrival of sensors, observe and manipulate, robot revolution, avatar. In 1908, the German sociologist Georg Simmel wrote about the abiding question of the difference between nature and culture. Culture, he wrote, exists only if man draws into his development something that is external to him. Cultivation is certainly a state of the soul, but one that is reached only by means of the use of purposely created objects. But for Simmel, the technological objects of modernity, artifacts of human imagination and ingenuity, were becoming increasingly autonomous, controlled, as he put it, by an internal logic tied to their instrumentality, unable to be absorbed, to add to cultural experience. As the futurists embraced the iconic turbines of a mechanized utopia, as Malevich and Kandinsky explored the ravishing geometries of an abstract visionary landscape, the instrumental logic of brute indifference was also being born. Modernity, nothing if not enraptured by the rabid calculations of the new, seems to have barely noticed that the new, by its very nature, would consume and be consumed. I did not catch the names of the three techno-gurus on the NewsHour, but not long afterwards I saw a review of a book in the Times, and the author's photo was of one of them, Jaron Lanier. Lanier's book is called You Are Not a Gadget, a Manifesto. Lanier, who was born in 1960 and was an early participant in the dot-com revolution, credited with the formulation virtual reality, sets out a series of fragmentary perceptions and comments from, as it were, inside the game. He speaks about cybernetic totalism. He says information is alienated experience. He says that the ideology of the digital world has failed both spiritually and behaviorally. The spiritual failure denies what he calls the mystery of the existence of experience. The behavioral failure involves what he calls the ubiquitous invocations of anonymity and crowd identity. The utopian vision of a free and open culture that might turn toward economic benefits for many, if not all, has also failed. The middle class continues to dwindle, wealth continues to concentrate. If we can't formulate digital ideals before our appointment with destiny, he warns, we will have failed to bring about a better world. Instead, we'll usher in a dark age in which everything human is devalued. Manifestos by nature are given to exaggeration and hyperbole, but Lanier stirs up free-floating anxiety. What we assume is given, our humanity, might be being taken away, eradicated, annulled before our very eyes. We have heard such alarms before. Ortega y Gasset in 1948 thought that abstraction was dehumanizing art. Television was seen as the death of familial conversation and literacy. It is hard to separate the message from the messenger. But the instrumental products of our culture, these gorgeous, sleek toys, do seem to turn everyone into objectified data, indifferent or immune to our status as persons with lives beyond Facebook communities, instant replays, and replies. How might we inhabit this other world, unrecorded and unobserved? Do we cease to exist when we are here in the actuality of a physical elsewhere? My young friend Andrew's message on his cell phone says, I am not here, but here has no location. Increasingly, I am aware that what I have chosen to do or to be in my life is of decreasing relevance to the ways in which we think the world. Poetry, particularly contemporary written poetry of an experimental bent, has been dropped from the considerations of nearly all media outlets and is rarely referred to in our conversations. It has, of course, found ample refuge in the promiscuous animations of the internet, in blogs and websites, both useful and influential, at least to poets and students of poetry. As Ubu webmaster Kenneth Goldsmith is said to have remarked, if it isn't on the internet, it doesn't exist. This is not an uninteresting statement, connecting the neutral pronoun it to the idea of existence, or rather non-existence. We have heard this it before in the objectification of our soldiers, of their prisoners at Abu Ghraib. Persons can easily become its. Poems that are structures that specifically resist the objectification of persons and the instrumentality of language. Many people think poems are little dressed-up narratives of self-reflection, expressivity, and catharsis, and indeed, many are. In a world that offers an endless glut of glittery selves that rise and fall through the limitless ether like Milton's angels, it is not difficult to understand why poetry has become anathema in the public imagination. It neither fully informs nor fully entertains. The best poems ride along the edge of relation where consciousness forms, opening the subject into the myriad predicates that constitute it. As cultural theorists, contemporary poets, and philosophers have told us ad infinitum, the grammatical shifter I is not synonymous with a self, and a self cannot be either fully revealed or discovered in language. I once heard John Ashbery remark, I am John, Ashbery writes the poems. As we poets teeter on the verge of extinction, we might find comfort in the words of Giorgio Agamben. Those who are truly contemporary, who truly belong to their time, are those who neither perfectly coincide with it nor adjust themselves to the demands. They are thus, in this sense, irrelevant. George Oppin's great poem of Being Numerous from 1968 is, among other things, a meditation on the notion of the individual, the one. Oppen is exemplary for many of us, partly because he stopped writing poetry for 20 years in the face of an urgent politics which he did not think poetry should or could address. He was included in the group called the Objectivists and had no truck with the augmented expressivity commonly associated then as now with poetry. His abiding value was clarity, clarity, as he wrote, in the sense of silence. I understand this form of silence, like that of John Cage, to be a trope for receptivity, for listening and waiting. Here are some lines from his poem. We are pressed on each other, and we will be told at once of anything that happens. And the discovery of fact bursts in a paroxysm of emotion, now as always. Crusoe, we say, was rescued. So we have chosen. Obsessed, bewildered by the shipwreck of the singular, we have chosen the meaning of being numerous. For Oppen, the urban crowd flowing through the city displaces the solitary, meditative man. The instant relay of event unleashes a paroxysm of emotion, and the mineral fact of the material world, accompanied by what he calls the intensity of seeing, contributes to the bright light of shipwreck. The urban did not hold for him the delectable anonymity of the flaneur, nor the insouciant serendipities that Frank O'Hara celebrates, nor the dystopic enclave of production of Warhol's factory. The upsurge of experimental freedoms of the 1960s appeared to Oppen as ominous. The poem, here breaking into prose, continues, or in that light, new arts, dithyrambic, audience as artists, but I will listen to a man. I will listen to a man, and when I speak, I will speak, and he will fail, though he will fail, and I will fail, but I will listen to him speak. The shuffling of a crowd is nothing, well, nothing but the men that we are, but nothing. Urban art, art of the cities, art of the young in the cities, the isolated man is dead. His world around him exhausted, and he fails, that meditative man, and indeed they cannot bear it. And indeed we cannot bear it. Oppen anticipates the erosion of inwardness, not as self-absorption or narcissism, but as the receptivity necessary to thoughtfulness. He could not have known that thought would be consigned to opinion or to the reclusive preference of brilliant eccentrics like J.D. Salinger. He could not have predicted that our thoughtful president would be vilified for lacking the aggressive temperament we have come to mistake for leadership. Oppen's image of the bright light of shipwreck conjures for me all the untoward suddennesses of our times, bombs exploding, towers falling, earthquakes rupturing, the flash of annihilation that hovers just on the other side of our earthly existence and over which we have no say. For my generation, this hovering extinction was a given, felt as imminent threat from an implacable, monolithic other abstractly framed. It was an it, disassociated from persons. For this generation, the threat finds itself secreted, both intimate and diffuse, tucked inside cars and trucks and the undergarments of individuals whose care for this life, her life, his life, your life, my life, has been forfeited. This indifference to earthly life speaks into the absolute negative, where nothing is given in the here and now, and where the idea of choice presents itself as numbing obedience and renunciation. Our culture of getting and spending, in Wordsworth's famous phrase, offers no appeal. Our rhetoric of freedom falls on deaf ears. But for this, our present moment, images of an apocalyptic catastrophe seem overly theatrical. What threatens are far subtler forms of destruction inflicted from within: erosion, recalcitrance, redundancy, inertia, expedience, literalism, impatience, fraud, abuse. What threatens is is a world of ostensible choice, staged as an infinite regress of mirrors, unmoored from either historical contingency or consequence, a world of viral proliferation without difference. It is as if modernity's signal value, the new, had reformulated itself as tractionless spin, where everyone is simultaneously present and absent in an eviscerated but engorged now, where nothing of actual consequence can happen. Anne Hamilton sent me a book called Radical Hope: Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. The author, Jonathan Lear, considers the fate of the Crow Nation, specifically through the life of Plenty Coups, their last great chief. Plenty Coups straddled the world between cultural vitality and cultural extinction, living to tell his story and the story of his people to a white interlocutor. Lear is struck by the fact that Plenty Coups refused to talk about anything after the Crow were confined to the reservation and the buffalo herd was eradicated. He said, "But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened." After this, nothing happened. For the Crow, history did indeed come to an end. All that they lived for and believed in had vanished. Lear wonders what it might mean to have the concepts, the givens that make it possible to understand oneself go out of existence, concepts which inform, as he puts it, the intimate connection between thinking and being. He writes, "As it turns out, intending and hoping and wondering and desiring are not just up to me. They are not just a matter of exercising my will. And my ability to do so is not just a psychological issue. It is a question of the field in which psychological states are possible." The image of the field is, of course, iconic in the American imagination. It is probably not an accident that Lear evokes it here. The field extends into familiar tropes, weavings, meadows, waves, which inflect countless novels, photographs, films, poems, sculptures, and paintings. The field informs our idealistic sense of the interplay between the one and the many, sameness and difference, our dream of mobility in the elastic lens between distant horizon and garden gate. Iterations and images of fields can be found in Whitman and Pollock, in Anne Hamilton and Agnes Martin, in Charles Olson and Robert Duncan, Maya Lin, and James Schuyler. Schuyler wrote, "Past is past. I salute that various field." The image invokes the agrarian romance of the farm, the killing fields of war, the mute graves of the dead, and the vibrant play of games. It announces the distinctive limit of the chosen. We have, we say, a field of interest. The field reminds us of the particular attachment we have to place, how that attachment has informed the geography of the mind. The Crow lost their field of vision. What would it mean for their victorious enemy, ourselves, to lose ours? And who among us has the wisdom of Plenty Coups to know when nothing has happened? I have a collection of small works, paintings and drawings and sculptures, most of them gifts from friends and students. Like my books, I think of these objects as providing mute but tangible company. The pleasure I take from them is derived not only from their surface charms. Each of them has within itself a temporal history of choices and decisions that is at once tacit and evident. My sense is that our love for certain artists and writers is bound up in our capacity to know or read this active field of engagement or call and response, ways of distinguishing turns of mind, indeed to experience or inhabit the very moments of choice. I'm not referring here to merely the stylistic revelations of suturing or gesture, but rather to a more subtle kind of imminent unraveling in the motions of composition. Works of art restructure the present, anchoring it to the ground of an embodied materiality that has within itself the history of its making. Gerhard Richter, Notes, 1990. Except that I can plan nothing. Any thoughts on my part about the construction of a picture are false. And if the execution works, this is only because I partly destroy it, or because it works in spite of everything, by not detracting and by not looking the way I had planned. I often find this intolerable and even impossible to accept, because as a thinking, planning human being, it humiliates me to find out that I am so powerless. It casts doubts on my competence and constructive ability. My only consolation is to tell myself that I did actually make the pictures, even though they are a law unto themselves, even though they treat me any way they like and somehow just take shape. Because it is still up to me to determine at what point they are finished. Picture making consists of a multitude of yes-no decisions with a yes to end it all. If I look at it that way, the whole thing starts to seem quite natural again, or rather nature-like, alive, and the same thing applies to the comparison on the social level. Photographer Jeff Wall in an interview. When I started to work with the computer, I had the idea that I could use the otherworldly special effects to develop a kind of philosophical comedy. This makes me think of Diderot, of the idea that a certain light shown on behavior, costume, and discourse creates an amusement which helps to detach you from the immediate surroundings and projects you into a field of reflection in which humanity appears as infinitely imperfectible. This imperfection implies gentleness and forgiveness, and the artistic challenge is to express that without sentimentality. He continues, I guess the key metaphor in these works is learning. We learn. We never complete the process of learning, and so learning is a kind of image of incompleteness and limitation, but a hopeful image as well. He says that in one of his works, The Stumbling Block, I thought I could imagine a further extrapolation of society in which therapy had evolved to a new, maybe higher stage. In my fantasy, the stumbling block helps people change. He is there so that ambivalent people can express their ambivalence by interrupting themselves in their habitual activities. Michael Brenson, The Look of the Artist, 2010. My hunch is that most writers, curators, and critics who regularly ask themselves, what am I looking at, don't hear the more reflexive and dissonant question. They don't hear the I as also a you, or the you as the I. I cannot detach what am I looking at from what are you looking at. The latter establishes within me an awareness that even in the moments of intense concentration, I'm a stranger to myself, or rather that there's a stranger in myself, or rather there's a crowd in me, each member of which has had and still seems to want some voice in my perceiving and thinking. What am I looking at gives me the feeling of being welcome to exchange territories in an encounter whose potential cost to me is moderated by a process of reciprocity and transition. What are you looking at asserts the shock and risk, the challenge to process of another experience of looking, one in which I do not know who is holding the cards or whether there is even the possibility of a conversation. The question establishes the existence in me of a vast psychological, sociological, political, and linguistic network. Taken together, these three quotations begin to suggest the kinds of interactions that inhere in our experiences of art, whether as creators, readers, critics, or observers. Each has entered a set of relations in which subjective and objective realities, the self and the material world, seem to engage in a potentially radical morphological change. They seem to suggest that when a given subject finds its form, something is released. My rather prosaic name for this thing is content. Content subverts the easy see-through that imagines we are transparent to each other. Content, the alignment of subject with form, shifts us simultaneously toward the other and away from ourselves, opening the space for the connective tissue of meaning to be made. In his final work, Pure Imminence, Essay on a Life, Deleuze wrote, "But we shouldn't enclose life in the single moment when individual life confronts universal death. A life is everywhere in all the moments that a given living subject goes through and that are measured by given lived objects. An imminent life carrying with it the events or singularities that are merely actualized in subjects and objects. This indefinite life does not itself have moments, close as they may be to one another, but only between times, between moments. It doesn't just come about or come after, but offers the immensity of an empty time where one sees the event yet to come already happened in the absolute of an immediate consciousness." This evocation of a kind of molecular paradise of incipience, out of which certain objects and subjects precipitate, converting what is potential into the actuality of immediate consciousness, captures some of what I am trying to evoke. The plane of imminence reminds me of Agamben's notion of the moment of arising, which is objective and subjective at the same time, never the emergence of the fact without at the same time being the emergence of the knowing subject itself. I want to attach Agamben's notion of a moment of arising and Deleuze's notion of the plane of imminence to my sense of what it means to allow a work of art to alter the givens of a life. I want to suggest that works of art might embody these abstruse and enigmatic ideas. The moments of imminence that the artist experiences are collapsed into the work, to be revived or reimagined by the spectator when she enters its arena. Agamben's moment of arising, the undecidable threshold between object or fact and subject, captures the alteration between subjectivities and historical contingency that the work of art precipitates and fosters and confirms. Perhaps the experience I'm trying to name is simply what animates the conversion of information into knowledge, where what we know is attached to reality through beliefs as well as facts, where effective reasoning informs our choices, decisions, and judgments. You may have noticed that this final term, judgment, has been left out of my talk. It seems evident that we are living in a time of nearly continuous judgment with little connection to the deliberative preludes entailed in choices and decisions. Works of art stop before judgment occurs. They invite us to enlarge our capacity to integrate, absorb, and interpret. They may as well show us how to resist or refrain, in the words of Melville's Bartleby, to prefer not to. Works of art pivot and oscillate, activating the givens that belong to both maker and recipient, causing them to relax their grip, release their boundaries, finally to risk autonomy in the face of alterity. I want to end by turning to one of my most enduring companions in thought, Emerson, and to his great essay, Experience, from 1843. Where do we find ourselves, he begins. He does not ask, where do I find myself, although the central underlying event of the essay is the death of his young son, Waldo. Emerson begins in a state of paralytic denial, in which he says the loss of his son has had no impact, has changed nothing. I grieve that I cannot grieve, he writes. Emerson begins his essay in what Emily Dickinson called the hour of lead. As he writes, the essay, which I think of as a prose poem, takes on a kind of animation, breathing and exhaling at an almost impossibly slow pace. It meanders and it dwells. The sense of wandering makes it impossible to capture or to paraphrase. I cannot ever recall what it says, although I have read it dozens of times. The sense one has is that one is undergoing something, of being drawn through a constellation of emerging and disappearing tropes and topics. This attenuated and circuitous journey, this ingathering, pivots for Emerson around the fact of subjective consciousness. It is very unhappy, but too late to be helped, the discovery we have made, that we exist. Knowledge that we exist brings forth knowledge that we shall cease to exist. Nothing left us now but death, he writes. Indeed, there is nothing in the material world that is not elusive and slippery. I take this evanescence and lubricity of all objects, which lets them slip through our fingers when we clutch hardest, to be the most unhandsome part of our condition. At every turn, we sense the abiding fact of the death of Waldo. And yet, slowly, phrase by phrase, the writing begins to alter its webs of negative intransigence. It ends, never mind the ridicule, never mind the defeat. Up again, old heart, it seems to say, there is victory yet for all justice, and the true romance with which the world exists to realize will be the transformation of genius into practical power. For Emerson, experience, the experience of writing the essay called Experience, results in the transformation of genius into practical power. His deadened, inert heart comes back to life. Genius, the given, finds the will to animate the recalcitrant and obdurate into new forms of practical power. The shut world opens out. The given and the chosen greet and touch across the threshold. Thank you.
An aside on one of your last choices of quotation, Melville's Bartleby is a satire on a man who edited a literary magazine that had strongly promoted Melville early in his life. And that man was either the fifth, sixth, or seventh generation of art and literary people, the Dykings. And there were at least 4 generations of portrait painters, some of them of very high quality indeed. So it's amusing that this comment refers to someone who not only had promoted Melville early in his career, but came from a long line of people who made paintings and literature.
Thank you.
The title of the book about the crow, it was Hope, or what was the title?
It's called Radical Hope.
Radical Hope. I was curious if you feel that we're in a time of the necessity for radical hope. And
I didn't actually go into what Lear's takes to be his critique. I didn't get to the part that is the radical hope part, which is quite complicated. But essentially, he talks about these 2 dreams that Plenty-Coup had and narrated, and the dreams were sufficiently embedded in the Crow belief system that they could actually come out into the world as potential, at least partial resuscitation. And the part on radical hope in Lear's book is called, it's a critique of analytical reason. And so he's very clearly saying that if we could stand to move away from the way in which we understand things, which is usually a kind of analytical reasoning that maybe, I mean, I'm extrapolating, but that's what he says, and he does it quite beautifully. He's not a very good writer, but the argument is quite wonderful, because he says you don't have to actually believe in, you don't have to buy the story of the chickadee. You don't have to have the faith in it. But the fact of the dream as being this kind of possibility of an animation of this ruined space, this ruined field of value, is what's important. So for me, it's about possibly, I don't really feel quite as pessimistic as maybe this sounds, but it's about a bit of a fear that we're losing even knowing what those things are. You know, what the names of those things are that make it possible for us to go through. Now it seems a continuous political and social undermining that increasingly makes us feel, I think, quite paralyzed and unsure. So this meditation is really about, in some fundamental way that, well, at least for me, these operations of art making are one of the places to look if we can pull our thinking about art away from objectifying art, which is, of course, what capital wants to do, because once you do that, then it's easy to move it around and pass judgment on it and all the rest of the stuff that we're all very tired of thinking about.
Hi,
Hi.
your early reference about the Gazette, and from what I remember reading it again several years ago, it probably came from dehumanization in art.
Yeah.
And thinking back now, at the time he was reassessing abstraction.
Yes.
And it caused such an incredible uproar of reactionary, among people even who knew him. But that was the time when abstraction was in its infancy.
Absolutely.
But looking back now, don't you think it was a kind of calling for a humanist?
It's a very the piece itself, the essay, which is in the Howe collection called "The Idea of the Modern." There's lots of kind of interesting early pieces by people with opinions about the modern. And that one sticks out because of this quite powerful indictment of abstraction as a leaving behind of the human, in sense of mimesis, in representations. He talks about there isn't a house, there isn't a dog, there isn't a person, and that's the beginning of this kind of leaving of this human space. It's very, very. It's incredibly interesting to read it because it's intelligent and felt, and of course reminds us that those kinds of anxieties, or these kinds of anxieties that we may now have about the net, are always extreme. I mean, they don't have to be as alarmist as they seem to be. I find that essay incredibly interesting, given possibly the ways in which we have well, no, I don't know how to say this. I guess there's something in the problem of thinking about abstraction even monolithically, as if it were a single thing. The reason why I mentioned Malevich and Kandinsky is to not assume that abstraction just belongs to, our gang. It was everywhere in very different kinds of modalities, meaning very different kinds of things, and holding very, very different kinds of affective and spiritual registers.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, Anne. I really enjoyed it. I was especially moved by your description of the problem. I haven't heard people state it in quite that way. There seems to be just people's attitude towards technology and towards networked consciousness and the social and networked environment seems relentlessly positive in a way that strikes me as being very strange. But the kind of way in which she took away all hope at a certain point in the essay and then kind of built the hope back up. I was a little confused, though, about the ending of it because, I mean, it in a way, I guess you sort of went back to Emerson and you sort of ended up saying, well, this is sort of in Emerson already, and it's sort of like what poetry inherently does, or what. But I was confused by the detour through Agamben and what. I mean, I'm interested in this because I've been writing about Emerson and how I think he calls for a kind of reader who would be very involved and leaves a lot of space for that reader and invites the reader in. And that Emerson doesn't really make sense, and you have to do a lot of work to read him. So I'm wondering where the hopefulness comes from at the end, because I did feel hopefulness, but I was confused.
I guess the hopefulness comes from this sense of a slow engagement and and the idea that we can, with these things that we make or write, or we can find our way out of the kind of deracinated solitude that we seem to be heading into, that we can find some other thing to happen that is beyond critique, but that it has some other kind of energy in it. I mean, critique is wonderful and fine and exhilarating, and I love, reading Roz Krauss. I'm just completely blown away by her. But there is this other kind of idea of the register of the affect, which is why particularly that Emerson piece interests me, because he denies he has any feeling at all in the beginning. And so the idea that you go into an experience of making something or receiving something that's made in this kind of dead space, like it's interesting, the heart that falls on the ground for the crow is also the heart that Emerson doesn't have. And when he says, "Up again, old heart," you can almost feel this sense of this dead thing coming back to life. And there's this another beautiful little moment in it where he says, "Patience and patience, we shall win at the end." This idea. So part of what I'm talking about is just this notion that we're all so ferociously anxious about getting somewhere, and we haven't. It's very hard to talk about this without suddenly becoming extremely obvious, which I don't really love being. It's not like smelling the roses, is what I'm saying. It's something about something a little more complicated.
Well, right, and I wonder to what extent is that tied to that pairing that you get from Stevens and then that reappears briefly in Oppen about the chosen and the given, and it occurs to me that those are both sort of terms with an honorific leaning, and I wonder what, does the rest of that solution lie in what's not chosen and what's excluded, for example?
Well, there's that, but there's also, I think, part of the kind of interesting piece of this for me in writing, which I don't think is quite. Is this Tim I'm talking to? Who am I doing? Yeah. What was hard for me and interesting to try and do was to pull both the idea of the given and the chosen away from objects as commodities. In other words, the exchange place. I wanted to try and figure out whether there was a way to get into that space of giving and choosing that was beyond some kind of thing of what we always do, which is to shop, and to exclude that way. But I'm so interested in the mechanism of these more profound. No, they're not really more. The materiality of language and the choice the poet makes seems to me to be fundamentally interesting and fundamentally important to know about or to engage with. I mean, that's just me. I think it's exciting. It's why, I'm here.
I think one of the reasons it was hard to start the questions was because it's not exactly clear where you fall. I think you're resuming, a set of discourses that aren't necessarily all yours, and so it's hard to ask a question. But one of the things that I saw is this kind of duality you set up between the technological and something that sounded to me a lot more like a more lyrical conception of art making, of poetry. And I guess the question I have is, when I think back on a number of instances in history of modern art, and that sort of polarity kind of comes together with a polarity of sort of a more old-fashioned conception of making and a new technological making. But when I think back on, modern art and instances such as the Bauhaus, obviously the show, people there were really interested in technology as a position with which to move against move against capital, right? I mean, a lot of the people that came out of the Bauhaus and who fled Europe during and after the war ended up working on all sorts of like cybernetics projects that in fact gave rise in the 50s and 60s onward to the information age that we deal with. And so I don't see necessarily a conflict there. And I guess this is a way kind of to lead up to a question like, do you really feel like we need something like a lyric subject in order to have a sense of art making that would be in some way oppositional or necessary, or maybe is it possible to think about writing without that?
I think the word lyric is a very contaminated word, and because it just is, and it's. I think my argument is much more cautious than that, and much less fully oppositional. My setting of the notion of the possibility that we can move fully into the place of otherness interests me a lot. And that's much more interesting to me, or not really fully, but that the possibility of actually knowing each other on any level is somehow mediated through art forms in wherever they come from. I mean, I have anxieties, but I don't have positions. So what I was proposing was not some romantic return to lyricism, and quite the contrary, but a kind of wanting to have respect for our humanness. And one of the artifacts of our humanness turns out to be that some people write things, and those things animate that very thing. And I'm down with Jeff Koons. It's all fine. It's just a kind of the flattening space of the infinite. I mean, I feel like we're in this flat infinite place of the now, and it scares me because it doesn't feel like there's any actual traction. That's what I was trying to talk about. And that traction has to do with memory and with care and with all kinds of very normative things. No big highfalutin thing. I just love that Deleuze idea. I just think it's wonderful. This idea of a life hovering that precipitates into the life. Incredible idea.
I don't know if you equate otherness with subjectivity, but in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you were an art student, the word subjectivity was a little bit taboo. And it seems now that here and there, sprinkling here and there is more of an interest in this indwelling, which was considered too romantic. So sometimes maybe the word romantic is wrong now, but to define subjectivity. But there seems to be more of a desire in certain areas for this nature of this probing. And I'm trying to find another word for subjectivity, but it certainly was absent at a certain period during art schools, and I do find more of a return to it. Do you have any comments on that?
I guess I was trying to figure out something that wasn't just subjectivity in the sense, in that old sense, because it seems to me that, again, like lyricism, the notion that that when you make art, you're expressing yourself. I've always thought that was very bogus. I think you're having a conversation, and it's usually with the materials. But to answer your question, I don't really know. I certainly know that I went through the same time when certain desire for what's the opposite of subjectivity, objectivity, was apparent. But I think those distinctions in the world of art are really, really very, very useless. They're not very interesting. They're kind of dead ideas. And you know, my concentration in this talk on the idea of the subject as both things that are about things and come from people, persons, individuals, subjects. I was sort of playing with that idea. I wasn't really kind of saying, let's look at the subject again. Again, that's really not. I don't believe in these jurisdictions, or whatever you want to call them, directions, I guess directions. So, I mean, I think there's just so much misconstrual of what persons are in our culture right now. I mean, really radical, scary, disturbed, distortions of personhood. And that, I think, is important to think about. Because these sort of disturbed, invented persons, I feel like they're being traded very quickly through the world. You know, it's like there's a kind of trading space that doesn't seem to actually anchor anybody in her or his physical being, historical place. It's very hard for me to say this correctly, but you get a kind of sense of it. I mean, you could fold that out into the issues around the private and the public. I mean, that's another place to certainly go with this whole conversation for me. You know, what does that mean? What is the private? What is the public? What are we talking about? Which I only hint at in terms of this notion of hospitality and public space.
Are you arguing for ambivalence as a higher state of experience or consciousness?
Higher than what?
Well, than certainty, than knowledge or positions. I mean, everything that you sort of talk about that you don't like, and the things that you do like about art seems to be about understanding how ambivalence is really a much truer point of existing in the world than positions and certainty and those kind of things.
I think it's a happier place, and so I think probably, you know, I love that quote by Jeff Wall. I think it's wonderful, this idea that, you know, he can offer up a place for the ambivalent to go, ambivalence seems, I wonder if that's exactly, ambivalent, right? You have multiple valences, you have multiple places that you locate value. Yeah, I think I am. I actually am. It's a funny word. I mean, I think I use this rather maybe a little fussy word, which is the threshold. The threshold of reciprocity. It seems to me in order for that to really happen, there has to be a certain kind of ambivalence, which can open up into certitude and can open up into all kinds of things, but it doesn't, in the first place, have to be there. Something like that. It's about a process. And so I'd rather go into the process with this kind of, I mean, I have to say, it's painful to live life inside of such deep ambivalences, but I think I do. And it is about being interested in how certitude might come about as a result of that. That, you know, that there's, I mean, again, I think that's another reason why Emerson interests me, because he's so willing to circle before he comes to anything.
Thanks for your inspiring talk, Anne. It's very refreshing to hear the value of that you emphasize, which is the certain quality of relation to each other as a kind of and also the culture of a certain culture of making that mediates that as the kind of the way to approach art. Refreshing, very refreshing to me. My question then is, why should and is the art world as it presents itself to us now, given this context, of course, especially, is that still a privileged site to encounter that culture of making? I mean, why should it be, or is it, in your view, other than writing, of course, but say object making, is that still a privileged site to encounter the culture of making and intersubjectivity that you're praising?
It's a really good question, and I really don't know how I would answer it. I know that you know, I don't get to the city very much anymore, but when I do, and I go to, for example, the Museum of Modern Art, I'm sort of horrified by the strange parade that people, the parading before things and the never stopping and thinking or looking too long, you know, and that seems really sort of a little bit of that feels like a change to me. I mean, I seem to think that in earlier moments, gallery going and museum going was really about a kind of inhalation or a kind of real, I don't know, about a conversation, I guess. You know, that it was the beginning of a conversation. Looking at somebody's work was the beginning of a conversation with it and with others. I mean, that's sort of romantic, but I think actually that's true. I think when I was around in the art world a long time ago, I felt that was constantly was happening. And it was very exhilarating, and it didn't seem too much about, I could stop that because I'm always worried about going too far with some kind of extreme idea, but that isn't true. But the reason I talked about the stuff in my house is that I actually wanted to, I wanted to avoid saying, you know, when I saw this show, I think this about this work. I actually wanted badly not to actually begin to go into that place. And it's also why I quoted the people I quoted, because I was really interested in this experience. I mean, this is really the subject of this talk is about a certain kind of experience. And the fact that I think that a certain kind of experience, which art is an emblem of, it's not the only place where you can find it, is valuable. And that we need it, and that if we forfeit it and let something else come to stand in its place, certain things will happen as a result. I do really think I feel that way. And the privileged place of the art world, it doesn't have to, I mean, I've written about this other places. I think the art world should be the world, you know. I don't think it, I think it should be everywhere. And slowly, it gets to be other places than, you know, in these 10 blocks or those 10 blocks or that, you know, place. I think that's where it should be. The art world should be the world, you know, ideally.
Hi. That's why I was a little confused by your section on the internet, because the internet seems to me to be very much like a museum, or the museum is whichever way, that you can parade through it, or it can be a place for contemplation, for blogs, for thoughtful interchange, for really slowing down and seeing a film on YouTube, or reading a lot of poetry. So, is that a question?
It's probably that you've figured out a way to be in relation to that space better than I have. I find it overwhelming and not inviting, and I find it very, very hard to figure out what the correspondence actually is. I know it's there. I know it's possible. I know many, many people have found huge, you know, places of animation and comfort and knowledge in it. But for me, there's another aspect that I guess is quite threatening.
You mentioned the light of the shipwreck at some point, and this sort of field of reflection, or I guess, yeah, pastoral experience and things. And I guess I was curious to think, like, if you thought maybe they were two separate planes of existence or something, or like they're not the same thing happening at the same time, but one is a different emotion and one is a more like intense, scary kind of like, but like brilliant, you know, I guess reflection.
I haven't got the two things.
Like I guess that you have this sort of like a mass of memories and sort of calm ideas about what things have happened in the past, and then you also have this like consistent, or I guess very, very like present burning, or like I guess like wrecking of like what you thought was a constant, you know, in some way, or like a solid idea. It seemed like, and that was where hope comes from, is like the end of this. Like,
oh no, I think what it was is this. This thing that I think we've all experienced one way or another, where the given, whatever the given is, let's say what happened to you that you hadn't had a lot of choice about, those givens are much more malleable and changeable than we imagine. I think that's part of what I was trying to say. I think that's hopeful, that we're not stuck. You know, we have ourselves are malleable and movable, and our stuff, the stuff that we have, is also, I think, capable of making changes, going through changes that are consoling and potentially more than consoling, actually productive. Does that make sense? I mean, there's something about my argument is that, you know, if there is an argument here, it's that that the givens are not steady states. You know, they're not immobile. And I think about that in politics right now very strongly, you know, that we have this flexibility in ourselves, and we have a politics that's become completely inflexible. And I don't understand, you know, and I think part of the anxiety, or even part of the reason for writing this, has something to do with that, with seeing that, with understanding why is our politics so completely stymied And a lot of this is about, well, because nobody wants to listen and nobody wants to change, etc. And thoughtfulness seems to me to be a value that is real, to be thoughtful about things rather than just reactive. So Suzanne's question to me about the internet, I knew that I was kind of doing a caricature. There's no doubt about it. But I was also interested in this book, this guy who writes this book saying you are not a gadget and knows a lot about how this stuff gets made and what's really possible. And so I thought, oh, it's not that I agree with him, it's just interesting this person from inside this camp has this anxiety or attaches this machinery to certain things that I really care about, and it turns out so does he. That's a little digressive, but I warned you I was digressive. Thank you all so much.